I would say there's this idea that to participate means that you have to give the rest of your free time to participate in local government. And if there is something of interest to you, your kids are in school. Just listen. Most community meetings are recorded in some way. Just listen to them. Just go, maybe ask a question. That is enough. It doesn't have to be something where you're serving on the board. You can just attend. And you can also say, I can only go for 2 hours and I have to leave early if the meeting runs long. All of those are acceptable ways to come to the table. So if you find yourself struggling to get into your community and to get involved, just make it really easy on yourself.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello and welcome to another interview episode of Care More, Be Better, a Circle B podcast that's focused on building a better, greener tomorrow. Since we've just launched our new site, circleb.co, please visit us and check it out. You'll find our entire catalog of 200 plus episodes. You'll also likely notice that we're doubling down on our efforts to build a greener tomorrow. One subscriber at a time, in fact. So if you join our newsletter, our circle, if you will, we'll plant a tree. It's as simple as that. This is thanks to an amazing partnership with Forest Planet. You'll also find a carefully curated selection of eco-friendly and natural products, from linen sheets and clothing made of only natural materials to housewares and garden supplies. You'll find sustainable jewelry, gifty goods, coffees, teas, dark chocolate, one of my favorites, and a few industry-leading supplements like Orlo Nutrition. All the products we offer seek to reduce our reliance on plastics, limit waste, and give a little back to nature along the way. We've partnered with 1% for the Planet to ensure that at least 1% of sales, not just of profits, go to the Earthwise charities like Forest Planet that we work with. Join our circle. Let's build a greener world together. Now, today I'm thrilled to introduce you to my niece, Arianna Bellizzi, as we talk about the need for community engagement and remembering to act locally first so we can create global solutions together. Arianna is a born and raised Californian who fell in love with the long summers, close-knit community, and all that Alaska has to offer someone in search of a new home, or her home, I should say. She recently finished a long, successful career at BBC Studios, where she led a highly skilled team for 5 years and developed relationships with small communities across the state. Arianna has immersed herself into the Anchorage community, joining the Arctic Entries story coaching team, providing management experience for local theaters, and connecting with the LGBTQ plus community. Outside of her professional life, Arianna finds joy in urban gardening, travel, and horseback riding. That's something else that we share. Well, with that, let me bring her to the stage. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks.
How are you doing today,
Glad
Arianna?
to be here.
First, about your journey from your education in theater to living up in Alaska. What brought you to this moment and your role as the executive director of the Federation of Community Councils in Anchorage?
Yeah, so as you spoke about, I do have a theater degree. I find that my theater degree has taken me a lot farther than the business degree that maybe my parents wanted me to get. I learned a lot, learned how to put myself in front of people, learned how to work in a team, learned how to think creatively. And so I worked in entertainment for almost 10 years, working at local theaters, and I worked at a theme park. And then I moved to LA and worked for BBC Studios on the Life Below Zero and Life Below Zero Next Generation shows. And that brought me to Alaska. And then when those shows ended, I was looking for a space that could take my creative thinking and take my leadership experience and take my networking and really run with it. And that's where I found the Federation. They had just recently lost their former chief executive, and they were looking for somebody to step into that position and kind of bring a new face and a new change to the organization.
Now, I realize that you just got your start in this role officially in March of this year, 2024. So, what have you learned so far in your first 4 or 5 months in this role that you feel applies to any community organizers?
Yeah. So what I found, especially as a young person, that I've felt really disconnected from the national conversations when it comes to what change could look like. And I've found that where I can really make change happen today is in the civic engagement space locally, right? So getting involved. Most local governments have boards or commissions or advisory groups where they're seeking citizen input about what's coming up in their community. And that's a great place. Like you can get on a board and have a voice in what businesses are going to go up in your neighborhood, what your roadways are going to look like, whether bike lanes are going to be included in Alaska, what snow removal looks like for our area, how you deal with our unhoused neighbors. All of that, they want public input. And generally, those spaces for public input are occupied by our older neighbors, people who have been around for a long time, but they're also retired and they don't have kids and they maybe don't have to work anymore. And so they have more time and space to be able to think about their community. But those spaces are desperately hungry for young people who are working and raising their children in their community. And they want to hear from a more diverse space or a more diverse people. And so, yeah, there's lots of spaces to get involved that are like low commitment to high commitment where you can make a difference and literally change what your community looks like.
Now, you mentioned unhoused. I think people living here in California, where I'm at, might be a little curious to learn that there's an unhoused community in Alaska where the winters are really, really awful. Recently, Gavin Newsom put into effect some interesting changes that involve the dismantling of many of the homeless or unhoused encampments. I wondered how this problem persists up in Alaska and perhaps what we should know about it in other states around, well, just the United States and other areas.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely not an expert on unhoused neighbors in Alaska or the United States, but I can speak to my experience and what I've seen, which is housing is an issue everywhere across the United States. We find that not enough homes are being built, not enough mixed family homes are being built, and increasingly, urban sprawl has to expand out because there's this priority on single family homes, or, you go to a city and you find empty lots or abandoned properties that haven't been taken up and haven't been built. And that can be for a variety of reasons. And so when you don't have enough housing, what you're seeing is people who are working full-time jobs, maybe 2 jobs, and are unable to get a house. And that is because there is not enough units. And so there's not enough stock. So rents go up and then they can't afford to move in somewhere. Or maybe they missed a payment and they got evicted and that is now on their record. Oftentimes there's very few landlords in these spaces as well. So you'll see just 1 or 2. And so even if you don't get evicted, but you're missing payments, and then that is on their record. So they may not want to rent to you when you do get yourself into a space where you can rent. So you see people living in RVs and their cars because they have no other options. There's just not enough housing available. And that's just as true here in Anchorage as it is in a lot of places across the United States.
Yeah, I just think it becomes so much more problematic when you talk about the extreme weather that you experience in that area. Just cold, long winters where it's dark a lot of the day. I realize you're not up in Point Barrow. Anchorage is a little bit more temperate than that. But still, this is not Venice Beach in California for certain. So you'd need different resources for your homeless population, the unsheltered people for the winter months as well. So as you become more integrated in this particular line of work, moving from the for-profit sector, working with BBC, to nonprofit. What major differences are you seeing so far?
There is a lot of work to be done in a lot of different spaces. And I would say the major thing that I see from moving from for-profit to nonprofit is that interconnectedness. When people come to community councils, they may come for a singular issue, right? To talk about their unhoused neighbors, to talk about a park, to talk about a public safety issue. There's a cross between a public safety issue and funding, right? Or a public safety issue and land use and zoning and code enforcement. What we're seeing in Anchorage is that for every person looking for a job, there's 2 jobs available. We have a crazy workforce shortage up here. And that means that our municipality is severely understaffed. And that affects everybody every day. Every day, there's not enough support being given, and the burden is going on the municipal employees who are there to work harder and harder. And so what I've seen moving into this space is that there is so much interconnectedness, and you can't just look at one issue and solve that one issue like you maybe could when you're trying to market a for-profit concept or item. There's less cross between all of the issues.
Well, I would imagine too, if you're talking about a community where there are more jobs than there are people, that you would have a harder time getting, let's say, volunteers to work an event because there's so much paid work to go around. If people have the time, there are jobs open for them to jump into them. So does that impact you from a staffing perspective, or put extra stresses on you to run this not-for-profit?
We don't really run on volunteers directly for the Federation. The community councils, though, are fully volunteer run. And so as the support organization, it's our job to outreach and help them grow the amount of volunteers showing up to their meetings, and also mentor their next board members. And so, yeah, you do see people who are incredibly busy and who go, I don't have time to be on another board, or I don't have time to care about another thing. I also see people, who they're just thinking about getting their next meal on their table. So they're not in a space to even think about civic engagement. It takes quite a bit of mental availability to be able to think broader than what's happening in your own life. You have to be in a space to support yourself enough to be able to think about others. What I will say is that according to most recent census data, I believe it was 2021, Alaska is second in the nation of likely to talk to friends and family. So you do see a very strong interconnectedness in the state. People rely on each other, but it is harder to then take that outside of inner circles and into, can we think about the community as a whole? Can we impart that across the whole community? And so you'll see people who have their hands in a bunch of different spaces because they're the kind of person who can and wants to think in that way. But it's hard to break into the world where people maybe aren't thinking about their broader community.
This leads me to a question I had that I was hoping we could unpack a bit together, because you were on a recent podcast where they were somewhat critical, I think, of the number of councils and saying maybe we need fewer councils and fewer people involved in essentially this community organization overall. I wanted for you to have the opportunity to talk about these kind of oppositional perspectives and how you might speak on behalf of these councils that may in some cases be struggling to get enough engagement from their communities. How should we be thinking about this?
Yeah. And I will say on that podcast, his thought was not to lessen engagement, but to just lessen the number of councils in order to increase engagement.
Like merge them or connect them in some way so that there's fewer of them, fewer group voices, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And in the United States, we often talked about redistricting, right? So these random groups of people who come together and set what a voting district looks like. And that is highly contested, right? You see these crazy districts. It's really uncommon in Alaska, but you see these crazy districts that are the weirdest shapes and they don't make sense. And What you don't see generally in neighborhood governance when you look at, we call them community councils, but across the US, they could be called neighborhood associations or neighborhood councils. The reason that they're set in more standard squares is because the idea of them comes from the neighborhood deciding what their boundary looks like. And so you see more, hey, this major cross street and this major cross street and the ocean and this park are our boundary. And therefore that makes us into this nice little square.
Almost like a school district too, because often school districts are more like that. They're more like a community that's affected by traffic and boundaries that kind of make sense, right?
Right. So that's the wonderful thing about neighborhood governance is that instead of 5 or 6 people coming in and saying, this is what the standard should be, you get to build it from the ground up and say, these are my neighbors. This is my community. And so when we're talking about whether they should be bigger or smaller, to me, that is not the conversation we should be having. The conversation we should be having is, does this community feel unified? Or is there enough split? So when you start to hear people say, for example, we have a community council called Sand Lake. And so if people internally are starting to refer to themselves as North South Lake and South South Lake or East and West, that's when all of a sudden this community is too big and it needs to divide, you know? Or if you have a community where maybe the population has changed quite a bit and you've seen people leave for whatever reason, maybe they built a big park and it took up a swath of land, or they put in new roadways or something, where like it would make more sense that because of the changing demographics and the change of the roadways over time, that land doesn't cut as neatly and that community isn't as organized as it was before. Maybe it would make sense to bring them into the fold because they're only a couple thousand and next to them is a couple thousand. And really those people should be more unified. I think about a great example is Fairview has their boundaries go right across a major artery. And so they are continually working on this effort called reconnecting Fairview. That doesn't mean that Fairview shouldn't identify as one group. There shouldn't necessarily be East and West Fairview. They are one neighborhood and they want to be that way. We wouldn't split them up just because a roadway goes between them, but we would think about what are those neighbors asking for. And so in any community, it should come from that neighborhood governance. It should be driven from a groundswell. And so, yeah, we could come in and make sweeping changes to the neighborhoods of Anchorage or any community. But what that would be is representative government coming in and telling neighborhood governance what it should do. And those are both important forms of governance, but they are separate. And it's important that they're separate because they serve different distinct roles in how we operate. We are not a truly true democracy. We are not like one person, one vote on every single thing. But on some things, we are. And that's where neighborhood governance kind of comes in.
So could you give an example of something that the neighborhood governance would cover as opposed to something being handled by your representatives in legislation?
Yeah. So neighborhood governance often in a grand scheme looks at what's called neighborhood plans. So what does this community want our area to look like over the next 20 years? In Anchorage, they do maybe 20 or 40-year plans, and they're trying to gauge like, how are we setting our rules now for what we want our community to look like in the future? And then they'll reset that plan, you know, in a couple decades. And so groups come together to create these neighborhood plans and say that we want, say, bike lanes, or we want better parks, or whatever, you know, we want to fix this like weird roadway that kind of divides our community. And setting those plans is something that is the work of community councils, is the work of neighborhood councils, because they are having the conversations day to day about how their neighborhood is or isn't working for them. And so you can't have a representative who maybe oversees 4 or 5 councils or 4 or 5 neighborhoods. You can't have them come in and say like, I think your neighborhood should look like this, because that person may not even live in that neighborhood or may not know those neighbors or may not be aware of like some of the conversations. Their kids may not be affected by a busing shortage in the same way that these neighbors are. So that's where you're seeing the commentary, is because it is so small, which is kind of like, why are we so focused on it being so small? But that's because only the people in your close area are going to be affected in the same way you are by when your street, for example, is on well water and the neighboring street is on city water, and they're redoing your street. And nobody has thought to ask that, hey, as you're redoing the street, can we get hooked into city water? That is only something your street is going to know about, really. Even government officials may not be thinking about it. And so that's where community councils and neighborhood associations filter in that, like, we have a very specific issue. How do we get it fixed? That's where neighborhood governance comes in. That's how they come together and support each other in moving in advising city representatives on how to fix things in the city.
Yeah. The reason I was really looking for an example is that, I think each of us, if we want to understand what it takes to get involved with our local communities and the types of things that we can affect and change, it's just really helpful to think that way. I'll give another example from my neighborhood. We know that there were certain things that went up for community vote. Like, for instance, when there was a old college, a Christian college that had essentially gone to the point where it was pretty decrepit and defunct and was going bankrupt. And they employed people in my local neighborhood, including the little old lady who lived across the street from me. Was her husband was a World War II vet. He had been a ball turret gunner and had gone down over enemy territory in Germany. I mean, we got to know them pretty well, right? She taught there. My other neighbor actually was their coach, and everybody called him coach, And so this college was going belly up. So a company came in, 1440 Multiversity. They had put their plans out for everybody to see. And frankly, I think everyone was like, yes, please, because that college owned a lot of the homes in the neighborhood, and they had started to fall down because they were just that old and that poorly maintained. Turned out that many of them had asbestos in them that had to be cleared out. Some were just tear downs, and others had to be updated to code for a present time. And now the entire space is really beautiful. It looks like a ski lodge neighborhood kind of nestled into the redwoods, right? So that affects everybody's property values. It also affects traffic because they have big events, and those big events bring in a lot of vehicles. That impacts the roadways. And then we have also experienced floods and fires in this area. So community members are getting more and more involved and engaged out of the necessity that they see in their local environments. I know that there are other things that go up for vote, like, for instance, when there's big building permits coming in. And one of the big questions has been water use. You mentioned well water versus city water. Well, water is a finite resource. And so the number of building permits that get approved have to be affected by water use. Well, guess what? We approved a lot of building permits over the last 5 years. And now we don't have enough water to properly irrigate the fields at our local parks. So there's this tension kind of vying from within the space to say, okay, well, we don't want all of our parks grass to completely dry up, disappear, and just be gopher mounds. So we need to assess and deliver water where it's needed. How can we make other changes that are going to facilitate the proper use of water? And does this affect future building permits for that reason? Also affects things like what's nominated as business property versus personal property, and how the zoning affects mixed use versus singular use. And it seems to me that more of the approved projects of late here in my area are mixed use. So it might be retail shops down below, apartments up top, or perhaps buildings that are more business oriented with storefronts in front and then set back behind them, residential with even shared parking lots in some cases. So it's really interesting to see how communities are addressing these things in their own way as needs erupt. And I frankly want to get more involved. So I'm on all their email lists now, and that's just step one, right? So
yeah. Yeah. And I would just say that version of community voting is something that exists in your community, but is not consistent across the US. So Anchorage doesn't have that level of community voting for those kinds of issues. There's certain things, mostly funding, that go to the general vote, but we don't have localized voting. Most of it in Anchorage looks like resolutions, or generally what these neighborhood associations are doing is networking. They are leveraging soft power to be able to push for what's of best interest. And it's by their board members and their organizational members who know people and who can help get the right ideas in the right heads to get, positive change in their community.
So, I mean, to your point, I don't know if I had the opportunity to vote. It was more like they posted the plans and the communities had these open comment sessions and also meeting opportunities where we could specifically connect with the developers and voice our concerns about their plans overall. The one real complaint I had is that I wanted them to keep the trail access open so that we could still use their trails, and now they've gone fully private. But
Yeah,
what are you
that's
going to do?
frustrating. But yeah, land use tends to be the number one thing that community councils or neighborhood associations handle. So that could be a number of things. Here it's liquor licenses, because we have a really limited number of liquor licenses and they're very regulated, as well as marijuana licenses in town. It also means building developers are required to have a community meeting here in Anchorage before they do work. And so that often happens through the community councils. It doesn't have to, but it does a lot of the time. And you rezoning, and then, plans that the representative government may have for Anchorage also will come often before community councils as a chance to hear thoughts and have some conversations that you may not be able to have those when you look at representative government. We have an assembly, and the general citizen gets 3 minutes to present in front of the assembly. That's not a conversation. That's a 3-minute monologue that they sometimes ask questions, but generally they're getting through so much public hearing that they just are listening and moving on, versus like in a council setting, you can have a question and answer. It's also important to note that like community councils and neighborhood associations, when fully functioning, are not the end of the conversation. They should be working in partnership with other organizations, other nonprofit, other interest groups. They are just focused in a geographical focus, but you'll also have issue-based and identity-based groups who should be working in an ideal world all together to like push for the betterment of their area.
Well, I gotta say, I'm really impressed with everything you've learned in such a short time. I know you've been up in Anchorage for some time, so you've been involved in these communities. I also understand that you recently achieved a certificate, I believe, in project management. Did you want to talk about that for a moment, and then perhaps how that might be used for something like community engagement or even activism?
Yeah, I got my certificate because the language that I was using in television was unique to television, and something that certification gave me was a more general language that crosses multiple industries. While I already had the experience, and the certification kind of helped me reaffirm that the things I already was doing were in the path of what is expected out of a project manager. What I would say here is that it does help when it comes to talking with subject matter experts. The community councils, like I said, deal with a lot of different things. And that means that I have to kind of be aware of and in communications with all sorts of subject matter experts across Anchorage. And so being able to read code or understand what a scope is or know who the stakeholders are in a situation is really important to just knowing how everything functions, and wasn't something I or I think maybe people outside of managing projects really know. I try to think about like, what is the lowest common denominator? What is the person with the least amount of experience going to go through? And some of these areas are really difficult to navigate. And so it's nice when council board members have a lot of experience to bring to the table and can kind of break it down for somebody who is just trying to understand how they can get a speed bump in their neighborhood. How do I make that happen? And planning and zoning is quite confusing. So who do I talk to and what do I ask for?
Yeah, it's like one of the most complicated flow charts I think you could create would be, how does the city manage all of their resources and who's doing what, right? So it almost takes that kind of internal perspective. And I think, yeah, somebody who's gone to business school like myself, I mean, granted, I didn't do that until I'd already been working for over 20 years. So, in my own way, I was like, well, I'm just really working to fill the gaps and see where I might be missing knowledge. And frankly, I already had all of that base. So some of the courses were quite simple and easy for me. Aside from accounting and calculus, that stuff has always been hard for me. But, I was able to complete it. And then I can speak or at least understand the vernacular that comes out of a CEO or CFO's mouth and feel equally weighted and positioned to be able to go toe to toe if I need to or when I need to. And yeah, so I always think education is really helpful and supportive. Everyone I've spoken to who has gone through some sort of certification specifically in project management has said that they felt like it prepared them to better manage multiple different styles of projects in and outside of their business life as well as in their personal side of life. So it seems to be one of the most utilitarian types of certifications that is out there for work in business. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, the reality that I think that the format is nice and that the education is nice. What it misses quite a bit is collaboration. I found that the area of people management was underrepresented significantly in the course, considering that the whole purpose of a project manager is to get the work out of the way for the people to do the work, right? And so that's what I talk about with community councils is my job as a full-time staff member is to get as much work off of the plates of the volunteers so that they can do the work of volunteering and I can do all the busy work for them. And that's not their responsibility unless they want it, but they don't have to do it because they have so much other work to do. And I'm asking for valuable free time of theirs. And so that means that you have to manage people. And I think my personal soapbox as a manager who really prides herself on being a good manager and really caring about my employees and thinking about their betterment is that there are a lot of people who are very good at their job who are managers and are not good managers. And just because you excel in a subject does not mean you should be in charge of managing people because you see businesses really suffer under poor management. Staff members who are really talented, really want to do a good job, and maybe their boss is really good, but their boss is unable to communicate or train or take accountability. And so then that lower employee does not want to step up because they're punished or micromanaged when they could be flourishing under a little bit more guidance and maybe a little less naysaying.
A little
And
less
I think that
oversight, like looking over your shoulder.
yeah, and I think that the project management section of people management is like, I believe it's only 20 or 30% of the overall score. I totally get that Gantt charts are really important, but like, are they more important than how somebody feels and whether they're going to be able to get that work done because their child is homesick? Like that, it's hard to teach those skills. And the focus is too much on the firm knowledge and less on the soft skills. And the soft skills are where generally I see people struggle. I can read the definition of a Gantt chart or like look that up, but like I can't teach somebody how to care, you know?
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a bigger problem in the world of business overall. And in fact, I think it's just the world, right? Like this is part of the problem, I think, of living in a society that is focused on individualism, because then the responsibility is on you to do the task and task oriented versus like learning the softer skills. It's not something that's easy to teach. I think in business school, they try to tackle that from the perspective of saying, A lot of your projects are group projects. So you have to find a way to collaborate and to work together to finish a task. And sometimes that means that you're assigning different parts of the project to people with varying skills. But then that project management piece comes in and it's like, well, look, I'm somebody who doesn't like to procrastinate to the very last minute. But there are 2 team members who are doing their work at the very last minute. And then none of us really gets the opportunity to review it and make sure that it's cohesive as part of the whole until the 11th hour when we're stitching everything together. And that creates its own problem, especially when you're thinking about a course term of 10 weeks. So from start to end of any project you're working on, it's going to be less than 10 weeks, which isn't real life for the most part. A lot of the complex projects that we might undertake could be months long, even years long. And what I'm encouraged to see though right now, and in this particular political climate that we're in, is that there's a lot of effort happening on the political side of the aisle where people from a community engagement perspective are working to bridge gaps and collaborate and even work across the aisle to get things done. So I'm hopeful that part of our culture can shift just a little bit. But I also think that part of the problem is that you have people that rise because they're really good at their job, but then they never get coached to work with people. So, we learn by doing. Sometimes you make big mistakes. And if you don't spend time in self-reflection, if you don't have somebody to be a sounding board that you can truly trust and open up with without fear of retribution yourself, then it's hard to grow.
Yeah, I always tell people that I'm training that like, I'm going to give, like, you can jump and I am your safety net. So, but you need that. You need somebody who at least can be a safety net for a bit. There's this concept, and I forget what the name of it is, but because we're so democracy focused as a country, we think about that it's just the greatest majority, 51% and we're good to go. Or if we have a quorum of people, whatever you decide quorum is, as long as those people agree to it, then it's worth it. But there's another concept where everybody has to agree. And that means that everybody's going to compromise, but everybody's going to agree. And so if we focused more on finding a solution that does fit everyone and it's not going to work for all concepts, I think, but I think when it comes to, we want to think about what our communities are going to look like. And if we can find work that works for everyone, even if everyone also has to give up something, but then there's greater buy-in on that process because everybody then has a vested interest in it because they all said yes to it and they also gave up something to see it happen. But it's slower. And so there's this idea that like government has to be quick and responsive and has to like move stuff really quickly. I don't necessarily think government always has to move incredibly fast in order to get work done, and that taking the time to like really get buy-in from everybody instead of just saying like, well, most of us agree to this, so this is fine, would mean that our community was like more invested in that work as a whole.
Well, one of the other problems I think that can enter our world here is when so many people are working on a project and somewhere along the way, it becomes evident to at least even like half of the people that this just isn't a good idea, right? Like we shouldn't do this thing. But everybody has put in so much work already and the plans are already in place that it just gets done anyway. Even if you discover halfway through the project that this is really not good for anybody, nobody's really happy, we could just stop. If we could just stop and roll back, and then everything would be fine. So one of the things I work to build into my work life and what I do is like say, okay, well, here's the project, but we have these guardrails and we have these moments in time where we're going to look at the project and say, does it go forward or does it get killed? And to make that part of just how you conduct yourself, to say nobody gets to have a complete sacred cow. Like this isn't just going to happen no matter what. Like we have these moments in time where we assess the project and say, does this make sense to go forward or not? And like the key ways that I'm integrating this is in product development, right? So like you're going to create a new product. You've done the market assessment. Things look good. Then you have some unforeseen circumstances that come in while you're working on the project. They could be competitive. They could be cost constrictions. It could be that some element of what you're working on suddenly became a lot more expensive and may have priced itself out of market, right? So you have certain sunk costs that you've accrued along the way because you've done the research, you've done the work, but there are these, you'd still lose more if you went forward.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
that can exist too if you're talking about, there's one, for instance, that came up in San Francisco, and I just heard about it through the grapevine, but it was like this entire community living in a fairly wealthy community within San Francisco wanted to go ahead and produce this park. And the budget was allowing them to go ahead and do this. But then one team wanted this restroom/community center that was built on it to be like this really high-end space. And there wasn't quite enough money to build it the way they wanted. And so because of this friction, nothing got done. Instead of reassessing and just perhaps scaling it back a little bit, it just got stuck in process. And so then nobody's happy and it's not happening. And it could happen differently if we just be willing to go back to the drawing board on this one thing and work through that again. But the project length and how budgets are allocated all affect whether or not it can get done because the money's set aside, but only in a certain way, right? Like complicated stuff that is above my area of expertise in this arena, but it just keeps me interested anyway.
And generally, communities are too small for us to be so angry that as we are against each other. Anchorage only has a little over 200,000 people in it. I run into people I may not like or I don't get along with or don't agree with politically at the grocery store every day. You know, our city and most communities, when you get to like the like boiled down community, are just too small for us to be as angry. And so I think everybody needs to do a little internal work and come to the table and recognize that we're all going to compromise on something. And it's important to know what you can and can't compromise. And maybe an aesthetic is something that we're willing to compromise on because we get the structure of what we're looking for. We're looking for a bathroom community center, and that is important. And the aesthetic that's pushing us over budget or doesn't work in this scenario, we're going to let go of, and that's true coming to the table and being willing to collaborate. And I think that's why I'm very glad that I have a creative background, because something in art that you're taught is to quote unquote kill your babies, which sounds like the worst cut from this podcast if you just cut that from me. But essentially the idea being like, you are going to create beautiful work, and not all of it is going to be in line with the greater team. And not all of it is, if you have a director or a head writer, that might not be within their vision of what they expected. And so you have to say this funny joke or set piece or lighting design or whatever it is that you bring to the table is not going to work. And you may love it, desperately think it's the best thing you've ever created, but it's not what's going to work with the greater group. Yeah. Yeah. And
yeah,
so
like when I said sacred cow, like you can't have one. You can't have a sacred cow, like your thing that is just, oh, this is the only way it can exist. Well, what do they say? You can, if you want to go far, you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go as a group. Like that's the saying. And I'm forgetting who originally said it, but if you want your sacred cow, you can go work on that on your solo project, and it may or may not come to fruition the way you wanted it anyway, because sometimes what you can work together on and compromise on as a group ends up coming out much better than you would have even thought possible. So I think keeping that lens and understanding that generally speaking, as a group, people can produce better work than any one person on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Well, is there any thought that you'd like to leave our audience with? Perhaps some takeaway that you'd like them to think about with regard to their communities and their work?
Yeah, I would say there's this idea that to participate means that you have to give the rest of your free time to participate in local government. And if there is something of interest to you, your kids are in school. Just listen. Most community meetings are recorded in some way. Just listen to them. Just go, maybe ask a question. That is enough. It doesn't have to be something where you're serving on the board. You can just attend. And you can also say, I can only go for 2 hours and I have to leave early if the meeting runs long. all of those are acceptable ways to come to the table. So if you find yourself struggling to get into your community and to get involved, just make it really easy on yourself. Set a really limited time frame, show up to one meeting, see or sign up for an email list that maybe can give you agendas and just read those until you see something that maybe makes you want to show up to the table. But don't feel like it has to be a big lift in order to get there. Your local government probably wants you there, and they're going to try and make it easy for you. So,
well, those are words of wisdom from your mouth to God's ear. Hopefully people will listen and get involved with their local communities. I have followed that same advice. I'm on the email lists, and there's a few things that I've chosen to champion. I've talked about them a couple times on this podcast. One of them was just pushing for composting in our county. And another was related to how we use our open spaces. So I went to the land trust meetings where they're talking about allocation of park resources, because those things are important to me. Now, do I want to be involved in every community discussion? No. Do I have the time for it? No. But I'm showing up when it matters to me, when it's something I'm passionate about and that I feel I can contribute to, which I think is part and parcel to that conversation too. I encourage people to follow their passions. Like, what are they passionate about in their community? If you're going down the street and something's constantly bugging you, like there's that pothole that never gets addressed, maybe show up, because you don't know. Maybe it's just nobody else has thought about it to the point of actually bringing it up at a council meeting to get something addressed and assessed. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, Ari. This has been amazing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
To find out more about Arianna Bellizzi and communitycouncils.org, see the links that we provide with show notes. And I encourage you again to take a moment and visit the blog page for this episode. There you'll find on our new website, circleb.co, all of the resources that we discussed in today's episode, as well as connections to past episodes that relate to the same topics we covered today. There you'll also find the full video version of this podcast and complete transcripts. When you join our email list, I will go ahead and donate the planting of a tree through this collaboration with forestplanet.org. So just by being a part of the community, joining our circle, you're making an impact too. In addition to that, if you choose to purchase anything on circleb.co, that will go to benefit this show and also the planet. We will be doing more donations to forestplanet.org through our collaboration with 1% for the planet. So spread the word, let's plant more trees, build that greener future. And for our longtime listeners, you may have already heard about Forest Planet when I interviewed their founder, Hank Dearden, many episodes ago. If you've not heard that, I'll link it with show notes so you can go directly to the episode and learn more about what they do. Thank you, listeners and watchers, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, we can engage as community, act locally, and build the future that we want. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.